Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to this installment of Tasting Together. My name is Pat Fahey. I'm a Master Cicerone. I'm the content director for the Cicerone certification program. And together we're going to be tasting and talking about Czech Premium Pale Lager this week. So as those of you who have tuned in before have heard in the past, with Tasting Together, what we're trying to do is offer a lighthearted but educational look at a given beer style or a specific topic from the canon of different things related to beer. We try to do that with beer in hand, preferably whatever it is that we're talking about. But if you don't have one of those, whatever you can get your hands on will work. And yeah, you don't have to do it with a beer in hand, but as I typically say, you're going to have a better time if you've got a beer going. So cheers. So if you've joined us in the past, thanks for coming back. The last time we got together, we were talking about the Imperial Stout style. If this is your first time here, one thing I always like to tell people, if you have any questions as we're going, just throw them up in the chat. I have somebody who's aggregating questions for me, and I'll make sure that I get to as many of them or hopefully all of them before we're done here. At least once I'm done kind of talking about the stuff that I have prepared to say about the style. And a couple of notes before we get started. As I think Shayna threw up in the chat, we do have our next few weeks of sessions planned out and posted. Next week, June 17th, we're going to be doing wit beer. Following wit beer, we'll be doing wee heavy. And then on July 1, we're doing a little bit of a departure from sort of the standard thing that we've been doing. We're actually going to be talking about beer and food pairing. And we figured for that first one, it would be nice to do something super classic. So we're going with American IPA and blue cheese. I wouldn't necessarily go out and buy your blue cheese just yet, but probably within the next couple of weeks would be a good time to go grab that. And hopefully that gives everybody time to secure one of those so that they can participate when we do that. And then the session after July 1, July 8, we'll be doing German Weiss beer. So other notes, if you haven't yet, go ahead, hit the subscribe button, help you stay up to date on what we're doing here on YouTube. Going to keep doing these sessions. And like I said, we're kind of starting to explore tackling topics outside of just beer styles. The CBS prep series that Neil was doing wrapped up recently, but we're now talking about potentially other things that we could have some other people doing. So we're going to make sure that we're continuing to put out stuff that is hopefully interesting and engaging and useful and helps people learn a little bit more about beer. Also on that note, I've mentioned a number of times, we're doing a Spanish run of those CBS prep talks with our Latin American business development manager, Chema Mora, running those on Mondays and Fridays on Facebook Live. The last one of those is going to be this Friday. He'll be talking about Belgian styles. So if you're a Spanish speaker and you want to hear about, or if you just want to hear about Belgian styles in Spanish, you can tune in 1 p.m. Central on our Facebook group. And then lastly, before we dig in, I wanted to extend a belated happy birthday to one of our viewers, Clayton. Clayton, your girlfriend reached out to me and told me that you guys are avid watchers and that you're preparing to take the advanced Cicerone exam in the fall. So hopefully you have a good time preparing and studying for that. Hopefully these help. And yeah, happy birthday. Cheers. So I'm already like a third into my beer. This is ugly. It's just too easy to drink. So this week we are talking about the Czech Premium Pale Lager style. And I am drinking Pilsner Urquell, which is the original of the style. They've got these excellent like retro cans. I have a backup just in case. And I've seen several people throw things out in the comments if you haven't already. Let us know what you're drinking. I've seen a number of people talking about Pilsner Urquell. I didn't see other ones in there, but I got a Mama's Little Yellow Pils. Lots of different beers going on in there. But in terms of glassware for this style, sometimes you'll see it served in a Pilsner flute, which is typically going to be a footed glass, little stem, and then either like a slightly rounded shape or just like a straight up V shape to it. But a lot of times you'll see people just drinking it in half-liter mugs or steins. I was fortunate enough to get to visit the Czech Republic last fall, was in Prague and then Pilsen, and pretty much everywhere that we went, we were served Pilsner Urquell in these like heavy-bottomed half-liter mugs. So I would say that this is a pretty common way to consume it. I've talked about this here before. Like, we've gone to great lengths to get rid of excess glassware here at home, but like these mugs are just awesome for drinking beer out of. So we're like, we have to get a couple of those. So that's that. So I want to talk first about the history of the Czech Premium Pale Lager style. And the history of this style is really, really closely tied to this brand, this specific brand, Pilsner Urquell. So I'm going to start just by talking about the history of Pilsner Urquell. And the story of Pilsner Urquell ties back to the city of Pilsen in kind of the mid 1800s. I think 1838 is the year that it's said that like a group of angry brewers who were upset over the generally poor quality of the beer in Pilsen came together in front of town hall, and they like dumped a bunch of beer out in front of town hall and were like, this will not stand. And so in coming together, they elected to build a brewery that would sort of use latest and greatest technology and the best brewing techniques known at the time to produce excellent beer. And that birthed this brewery that would one day be known as the Pilsner Urquell Brewery. This beer was first produced in fall of 1842. They actually used a number of different German ingredients and German techniques for production of the beer. The original brewmaster of the brewery was a Bavarian brewer named Joseph Groll. They used a Bavarian lager yeast for the beer. But one of the things that was super unique about this beer and about Pilsen was that the water in Pilsen is very, very soft, meaning that there's not a lot of dissolved mineral present in the water. And one of the consequences of that is that you're able to produce beer that, even when bittered to a relatively high level, maintains sort of like a soft, rounded, delicate character to its bitterness. A lot of the brewing that would have been happening in Bavaria at the time, many of the cities in Bavaria, like Munich, for example, have really, really high levels of carbonate in their water. Carbonate, when present in a beer that's heavily bittered, tends to give kind of like a harsh, soapy quality to the bitterness. So they were able to make this very unique beer, in part due to the soft water, in part also due to recent advances in malting technology, namely the development of indirect kilning, which allowed them to produce very, very pale malts, which consequently allowed them to produce a very, very pale golden colored beer. There were a lot of kind of technological developments that came together at this time to brew kind of like the perfect storm for this beer to explode in terms of popularity. One of the things that's commonly cited is that up until this point in history, glassware was very, very expensive, was a thing that was kind of only available to the upper class, but that recently methods of manufacturing glass at a lower cost had come into being. And so more and more people were able to drink out of clear glassware. If you're drinking out of an earthenware mug, what your beer looks like doesn't matter that much. And a lot of the beer up to that point was kind of dark and murky. But once people were finally able to put their beverages in glass, being able to see this clear golden beer was a really special and really exciting feature of this beer. So one of the things that I think is so interesting about this beer is that, I think you could argue that in the history of beer, there has not been another beer that was as influential as this one. And that's because, it was first brewed in 1842. From there, it was transported around continental Europe and quickly became very, very popular and spawned innumerable imitators. There are so many styles that are direct descendants of this one beer. Look at the entire family of German Pilsners or German Pils. Kolsch is another style that sort of came into being or was solidified around combating the popularity of this style, or German Pilsners descended from this style. American Lager descends pretty directly from the German Pils style, which is descended from this. International Pale Lagers. Even you go a bit farther afield, you look at styles like Belgian Golden Strong was in part influenced by public's taste and the popularity of pale, clear beers. So much of the beer landscape today is influenced by and tied back to this one beer from this brewery, which I think is really, really cool. So now, one thing that I want to mention, and it's a question. It's certainly a question that I had when the change was initially made, and it's a question I've gotten from people over the years. For those of you who were learning about beer or following beer style sorts of things before the 2015 BJCP guideline update, they used to call this style Bohemian Pilsner. And then in the most recent set of guidelines, which is now 5 years old, they changed the name to Czech Premium Pale Lager. And a lot of people were like, why? It's Pilsner. Why not call it Pilsner? And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that Pilsner is not a Czech word. One of the things that they really did in the most recent set of guidelines is they really tried for styles that came from a given region. They tried to be true to the way that the style is named or talked about within that region. So Pilsner is a German word. It is not a word that people in the Czech Republic use to describe a style of beer. That's the first reason. The second reason, and maybe even the more important reason, is that Pilsner in the Czech Republic is not a style. It is a brand. It is Pilsner Urquell. It is this beer. I remember when I was originally learning about beer, one of the things that I'd learned was that Pilsner was kind of like an appellation, only beers made in Pilsen could carry the name Pilsner. But that's not really even true. Pilsner within the Czech Republic is only used by this one brand. There are no other beers that call themselves Pilsner this. So Czech Premium Pale Lager does a better job of it's not necessarily the name that people would use for it in the Czech Republic either. They probably wouldn't talk about it as being a style of beer potentially, but it does a better job of encapsulating sort of the group of beers, which Pilsner Urquell is the most notable example. One other thing that I want to mention about, I guess it sort of plays into this style, but it's more just about Czech Czech beer and Czech drinking generally. One of the things that I loved about being in the Czech Republic is that their service is impeccable. You every bar that I went to, perfectly pristine, clean glassware, well served. Every beer looks exactly the same. Tall foam head, just beautiful, fantastic attention to detail. And kind of where I wanted to go from that is Czechs, like a lot of Europeans, place a lot of value in the foam that is present on the beer. In the Czech Republic, beers are usually poured using a side pull faucet, which allows them to produce this really kind of dense, wet, creamy foam. And due to the mechanism of the side pour faucet, you're able to very closely control how much foam you put on top of a beer. And so there are a few different pour styles. There are 3 really common pour styles in the Czech Republic. And the main difference between each of them is the amount of foam that goes on the beer. And I'm going to try with the pronunciation, just suffer through this with me. Czech as a language is notoriously difficult to pronounce, and I'm pretty hopeless here. But the traditional pour, the one that has the least amount of foam, is called the Hladinka, I believe. And even that one, like I said, the least amount of foam is still usually about 1/3 foam on top of the beer. The next one is called a Schnitt. And this pour is about 1/3 beer and 2/3 foam. And when we were touring Pilsner Urquell, I asked, what kind of the purpose of that pour was. And the guy we were talking to from the brewery, he gave a couple of different answers, but he said it was like what you'd drink if you needed to sober up at the end of the night, or if you're full after a big meal, or the kind of the bigger one, and the one that rang most true was, if you wanted to still be hanging out with everybody who's drinking but wanted to slow down your pace of drinking, you'd grab a Schnitt, because it's not as much beer, but you still have a glass in hand. And beer is just such a ubiquitous part of the social fabric in the Czech Republic. I think I pulled the number just before this, but Czech Republic has the highest per capita consumption of beer in the world. It's something like 150 liters of beer per year, which, if you factor in people that don't drink and children, they drink an incredible amount of beer. So, and then the last pour, which is one that I really love, I think it's such a fascinating tradition, is called the Mlíko pour. And Mlíko translates to milk in Czech. And Mlíko is basically a full glass of just foam. It looks like a glass full of milk. And the idea behind it is that you take it in just one draw. You need to drink it quickly before the foam starts to turn into beer. Sounds kind of weird if you haven't tried it before, but it's surprisingly refreshing, even though it's a lot of carbonation to consume in one draw. But it's a service tradition that I think is really cool and really fun. And definitely, if you're ever at a place that is doing really proper service of Pilsner Urquell and they have side pull faucets, ask them if they can do a Mlíko pour, because it's just a lot of fun. So, talk a little bit about the recipe and the way that this beer is produced. It's a pretty simple, straightforward beer. It's going to be all Pilsner malt. At Pilsner Urquell, one of the things that's interesting that they do is they actually malt all of their malt on site. They have a malting facility on site on the grounds of the brewery. So that's one thing that gives them additional control over their beers. Typically, the style is going to be brewed with classic Czech Saaz hops. That's Saaz. I've heard it pronounced a lot of different ways, but Saaz is typically what I go with. And when you read descriptions of Saaz hops, the classic description is spicy. Like spicy is the word that's given, which is really nondescript. It doesn't tell you a whole lot about the actual flavor. I was talking with Avery about this beforehand, just because anytime I need fact checked, I just go to her. And she said for her, Saaz is always kind of like peppery, earthy. I would say additionally for me, like I feel like it has a little bit of like a slightly minty edge to it, but kind of in that sort of peppery, earthy, minty, maybe lightly floral area. And this style is typically going to be made exclusively with that hop variety. Czech lager yeast is also somewhat unique, but I'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about process and talk about fermentation. And then the other thing, like I mentioned already, the soft water is kind of an important feature of this style, typically made with water very low in carbonate, very low in sulfate. Another place that produces hoppy beers or historically produced hoppy beers with a famous water source was Burton in the UK, where their water is super high in calcium sulfate, and that gives this really kind of like sharp, pronounced bitterness to the beer. This is kind of the opposite idea. Without presence of certain minerals, bitterness is very soft and delicate and rounded, even though the bittering level is pretty high. So talk about process. One thing that's interesting about Czech beer is that a lot of it is made using decoction mashing. I don't want to go too deep into decoction mashing, though if somebody asks a question about it, I probably will. But basically, decoction involves removing some of the mash and heating it to boiling, essentially, and then transferring that back to the main mash to raise the temperature to the next sort of resting temperature. And decoction originally was developed as a way to make it easier to use under-modified malts in a time when malting wasn't as well understood or wasn't as well controlled of a process as it is now. But it does have certain distinct effects on the characteristics of a beer. Because of that time when the mash is boiling, you're going to end up with slightly deeper color. You might end up with more enriched malt flavors. And also specifically with some of these beers, in addition to the decoction, because of use of like higher mashing temperatures, you end up with a beer that has a little bit less ability to be highly attenuated. A lot of these beers are going to end up being a little bit lower on the attenuation scale. So a little bit more residual sweetness, a little bit more body left in the finished beer. And that is in part tied to the way that they perform mashing. The other thing that is important about the process of these beers is the fermentation. It comes down to both the yeast that's used, but also the way that fermentation is conducted. When you compare it to kind of like the lager powerhouse of the world that is Germany, Czech yeast strains are typically a little bit less clean than German lager strains, meaning that they're going to produce a little bit more in the way of fermentation flavor. And also the fermentations are usually conducted on the cooler side of things, which makes them take a little bit longer. So, standard lager fermentation temperature is typically pegged right around 10 degrees Celsius or like 50 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of Czech lagers are going to be in the sort of like 7 to 10 degrees Celsius, so like 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a little bit cooler than might be normal otherwise. And one of the results of that you see in a lot of Czech lager styles is low level of diacetyl, that sort of buttery butterscotch compound. And that's signature in Pilsner Urquell. Personally, I'm pretty sensitive to diacetyl. I generally can't stand it in beer, especially if it's present in a place that it's not supposed to be. for whatever reason, in this style and like in English bitters or other English beers where it's sometimes acceptable, I'm like, yeah, it's fine. I like it. It's good. So it in this case, it kind of contributes to that sort of impression of fuller body and richer malt character, and residual sweetness. It's got diacetyl, but I'm not mad about it. So to talk a little bit about the flavor profile of this beer, like I said, it's in the grand scheme of things, like it's a rather straightforward beer, but it does do a great job of integrating specific flavors from each of the components. You've got kind of this very rich, fresh baked bread and maybe a little bit of caramel character from the malt that's used and from the Decoction Mashing. The hops give it sort of a spicy, peppery, lightly minty character. Like I said, there's that low diacetyl that kind of gives it a little bit of a buttery note, but also serves to just amplify the perception of the body and the malt flavor. And then it has a pretty pronounced level of bitterness, but once again, because of the quality of the water that's used to brew this beer, it's a softer, more delicate quality of bitterness. It's all of that kind of comes together to make this just eminently quaffable beer. This is a beer to drink in volume. We were in the Czech Republic for like 3 days total, and I do not know how much Pilsner Urquell we drank, but it was a lot of Pilsner Urquell. Liters and liters and liters. So the last thing that I want to talk about, per usual, is what you pair this beer with. And like a lot of beers that fall in sort of the general family of Pilsner and Pilsner-inspired beers, Czech Premium Pale Lager can work with a really wide variety of different foods, in part because it's sort of gentle enough to work with more delicate dishes, but it's also, and I saw Shayna poke fun at me saying quaffable a lot, but I have it in my notes again. It's quaffable. It's drinkable and bitter enough that it can stand up well to heartier fare. My experience, my limited experience with Czech food, but I'll say out of like every restaurant we visited in the Czech Republic that did like Czech food, it was all kind of the same. It was all like pork and dumplings and gravy and this like heavy and rich. And like I kind of mentioned up front, like beer is just part of the fabric of Czech culture. In many cases, beer is going to be cheaper than water. And it's something that, well, the brewers definitely obsess over the quality. Like you go to a bar, and I can't say for sure because I don't speak Czech at all, and so I don't know what people were saying, but they're not talking about the beer. It's not, there are definitely cases in the world of beer where it's like, oh, you're having this beer, like you're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the characteristics and sort of noting that this is just part of the background. It's in that it's everywhere. It's something that like is an essential part of social interaction. And so it works within the realm of Czech cuisine in the same way that it's like, yes, you could point to things that work well about it with the food. Like you've got some caramel notes and some bready notes that would work well with Maillard character that you'd find in like in a cut of pork, or you have the bitterness that will work to cut through the gravy that's in most dishes, or like really fatty sausage sorts of preparations. But at the end of the day, like it's just a super drinkable accompaniment to that food. It's something that, you can drink liter after liter as you're eating. So outside of that, though, outside of the Czech Republic, it can play a similar role in a lot of different cases. I think about pub fare, anything in the realm of like burger, pizza, fish and chips, all of those things work really nicely with a beer like this. When you look at this beer on paper, a lot of the characteristics line up sort of with similar notes that you might find in an English bitter. You have kind of a little bit of caramel malt character. You have that low diacetyl. You have pronounced level of bitterness. So I also look at like British bitters as sort of your classic pub beer. Due to the similarities in flavor characteristics, this can work well in a lot of those cases too. But then also, one of the things that is interesting about this beer, especially as a beer that has a significant amount of bitterness, is that it can work relatively well with spicier preparations of food, in part because of that fuller body and that bit of residual sweetness that the beer has. If I was going to go like Indian food, I wouldn't go necessarily as far as like pit this up against like a vindaloo, but maybe like a spicier preparation of chana masala, or you could do like a pork and adobo sauce, or a Hungarian goulash that's loaded up with paprika. Like, I think that this beer can play really nicely in a lot of those realms where you do have some amount of spice character going on. Honestly, due to its drinkability, there aren't a lot of places that I wouldn't put this beer. It might, you'd have to work to find a dessert that would work really nicely with it, but and it might overwhelm some extremely delicate dishes. But in general, this is a beer that can work across a wide variety of different dishes and cuisines. And Czech Premium Pale Lager and German Pils are two styles that I really like to keep around, just because they're so versatile and they're so drinkable. So that is what I have. And before I dig into the questions, I saw Sandra mention something about Ufleku in Prague. Ufleku is awesome. It's one of the best places in the world to drink the Czech dark lager style. It's a little bit touristy, but if you're ever in Prague and you don't go there, you're making a huge mistake. It's a delicious beer. It's amazing. A lot of fun. Had to re-up, sorry. Foam mustache. Okay, let's look at these questions. So Chris, the beer educator, with Czech lagers, I see a degree plus a number. Pat, can you expand on that? I am not 100% sure, but if I had to guess, it's probably relates to degrees Plato of original gravity. And even if it's not degrees Plato, it almost certainly is tied to the original gravity. You see this in a lot of, definitely in the Czech Republic. And like, if you look at BJCP classic examples, a lot of times the beers have a number associated with them. Beers in the Czech Republic are broken up into pretty distinct classes based on their original gravity, much like beers in Germany are. And I can't, if I was studying for a test right now, I would probably want to know what those categories were, but I can't remember distinctly all of like the Czech categories and the German categories, but they are delineated based on their original gravity, which is then, going to correlate to their eventual alcoholic strength and overall intensity, especially when you're looking at a group of beers that have relatively the same level of attenuation. So yeah, not 100% sure. Think it's degrees Plato, definitely ties to original gravity. Michael asks, notable differences Czech to German Pilsner, or Czech Premium Pale Lager to German Pilsner. There are several, and it's a good question, because that, for example, Czech Premium Pale Lager versus German Pilsner is definitely a tasting exercise that comes up from time to time on the certified Cicerone exam or even the advanced Cicerone exam. Biggest ones off the top of my head. Color is a pretty easy one. Czech Premium Pale Lager is usually kind of like more of a more gold in color, versus German Pils, which is usually more of a pale straw. So a little bit darker in color here. Attenuation is pretty different. German Pils is usually pretty highly attenuated, so light body, very low residual sugar, versus Czech Premium Pale Lager, which is usually more medium bodied and a little bit of residual sugar present. Bitterness level from an IBU perspective is usually pretty similar, but because of that higher level of attenuation in German Pils, the perceived bitterness is usually going to be a little bit higher in a German Pils versus a Czech Premium Pale Lager. One huge difference that's a pretty easy tell is presence or absence of diacetyl. German Pils never going to have diacetyl, or if it does, it was a mistake and it shouldn't have been released. Versus this style, especially with Pilsner Urquell, always going to have some level of perceivable diacetyl. I think that that's most of the key differences. Hop flavor is maybe slightly different between the two, where a German Pils is probably going to employ traditional German varieties like Hallertau or Tettnang or Spalt versus Satz in the Czech Pils, but those differences are pretty slight. So, second. People pay the same price for pours that are all foam from Kevin. I can't remember. I don't think so. It may have been a little bit less, but probably not that much less. One of the things about drinking beer in the Czech Republic, if you ever go, is that it's stupid how cheap it is. It is like insane. Half liter of Pilsner Urquell, of like the freshest Pilsner Urquell you'll ever drink, is plus or minus like right around $2 US. So, and at that rate, once again, like I said, I didn't necessarily notice, because when I'm paying like $2 for a half liter of incredible beer, I'm like, or somewhere around there, I'm not price sensitive at that level. So if it is less, it's not like a lot less. It might be like a buck. Like I want to say most Pilsner was like 49 kroner, which is about $2, and so it might have been like 35, so $1.50. Still, it's and I've only seen it in a few places in the U.S. In places where I've gotten like a Mliko pour in the U.S., it's usually been a place where I knew like the people working there, or was, had some sort of a relationship there. And so it was more like a complimentary one at the end of a session of having beers. So once again, I can't necessarily comment on the price. Alvaro asks if I tasted the tank version of Pilsner Urquell. Which differences did you taste? So I tasted a lot of different versions of Pilsner Urquell when we were over there. And you'll see, especially in sort of like specialty bars in Europe and in a number of places in the Czech Republic, what's called like tank Pilsner Urquell, where basically it's large tanks that are filled from a tanker truck of beer. And I don't want to go like I don't want to paint too broad brush, but like the biggest difference is just that it's typically a lot fresher. It's usually, and part of that is also just a consequence of the fact that bars that are serving tank Pilsner Urquell are usually, especially if they're outside of the Czech Republic, they're top accounts of that beer. And so they're turning over that beer really quickly. One of the things I will say, like when we got to Prague and I had like my first pint of Pilsner Urquell there, the thing that struck me the most was how bitter it was. And how bitter and how much hop aroma it had, just because it was so fresh. And so it presents with a much, I don't want to say sharper because it is still kind of like delicate and rounded, but it has a very pronounced level of bitterness when you find it super fresh. So, but in certain places in the Czech Republic, you'll also find it. You'll find unfiltered versions of Pilsner Urquell, which once again, it's often is going to just affect freshness, and in part, like the places that are serving that beer are turning it over so quickly that you're getting beer that's maybe a week old, which is awesome. So Jesse asks about naming convention. Brewers can name things whatever they want. Very true. What typically compels the use of Pils versus Pilsner versus Lager, American Pilsner, American Lager, etc.? If I had to guess, the biggest thing is going to come down to kind of marketing decisions. Like you'll see certain beers, I can't think of what it is off the top of my mind. It might be like Miller Lite or something that says like fine Pilsner taste. Like that's a marketing term in that case. You know, that's not a beer. American Light Lager as a style does not sort of, they're both lagers, but there's a world of difference between that and something like this beer or something like a German Pils. So yeah, I think it really, in a lot of cases, is going to come down to what the brewery wants to call it. Like I said, in the Czech Republic, you're not going to see other beers called a Pilsner other than Pilsner Urquell. In Germany, you'll see Pilsner or Pils or Pilsener. Just different spellings and takes on the same sort of thing. And then in the US, as is often the case for beers inspired by European brewing tradition, brewers will kind of call it whatever name they feel they like the best. You know, if a brewer is calling it a Czech Pilsner versus a Bohemian Pilsner, like I wouldn't say you can make any statement about like brewers that call it a Czech Pilsner. It tends to be more like this. It just comes down to what the brewer or the brewery decided to call it. Let's see. Ted asks a great and very complicated question. Why are there not pronounced tannins when decocting? So one of the things, and like I said, I don't want to go too off the rails on decoction mashing, but these sessions are typically an audience of people who are perhaps at a slightly higher level or want the more in-depth knowledge. So, you know, one of the things that you worry about when sparging following lautering is you don't want your water to get too hot because you don't, when you reach certain levels of, when you reach really high levels of water temperature, you begin to extract more and more tannins from the husks of the barley, leading to a very astringent beer. And this is actually a question that I had a long time ago. It's like, it doesn't really make sense to me. You know, you're taking a portion of the mash and you're boiling it with like you have wet grist and you have barley husks there. Like, how are you not just getting a ton of tannin extraction? One of the things that I think is an element there, you know, you worry about two things when you're sparging. Your water getting too hot, but also your runoff getting too high in pH. So one of the things that really leads to high levels of tannin extraction is as you pull off the sugar and pull off things from the malt, the pH of your kind of your lauter or of your wort gets higher and higher, and higher pH leads to significantly higher extraction of tannins. When you are boiling that sort of like thick decoction mixture, you've got a lot of buffering capability because you still have all of like the sugar and minerals and other constituents present from the mash there. So that buffering capacity is going to help prevent extraction of tannins. There may be some other mechanisms beyond that. I'm not 100% sure, but at least anecdotally, as you can see from a beer like this, like Pilsner Urquell is triple decocted. It is not a beer that has perceivable astringency, at least not to me. So decoction doesn't necessarily produce astringency in finished beer. And once again, there are like pieces of this where it's like, man, I know I read about this a lot when I was studying for a test a while ago, or when I had to like write up a rubric for a question to a test a long time ago. My recollection of it is just the increased amount of, or the increased buffering capacity of still kind of that rich wort before you begin to draw a lot of the minerals and dissolved materials from the wort that allows you to still heat it to that level without extracting a lot of tannins. That's a really good question. It's a really high level question. And I'm sorry that I don't have like an 100%, this is the way it is answer. Let's see. Chris asks, does Czech get more malt color from the decoction mash? Yes, that's a big part of the increased color of these beers. I can't remember, like the Pilsner malt that they produce might be kilned a little bit darker than you'd see out of like a continental, out of a typical continental Pils malt. But I think part of the color and the darker golden color of these beers is attributable to the decoction mash. Brad asks if Czech Pilsner is just a British bitter with different hops, or is that an oversimplification? Like from a historical perspective, definitely an oversimplification. From like a practical and flavor perspective, the other big difference is, I would say, and there are several. The hops are obviously going to be different. One big thing is you would rarely see a bitter that was this pale in color. Usually they're going to be a little bit darker than this, maybe even significantly darker than this, more in the amber range. Another big difference is that bitters are made with ale yeast. So in addition to low-level diacetyl, depending upon the brewery, depending upon the yeast that they use, a lot of British bitters do have some amount of yeast character present. So maybe some amount of fruity ester character. There can be other components to them as well. So there are definitely like some similarities between the two. And I will say in like blind tasting on exams, I've seen people call a Czech Premium Pale Lager a British bitter, but there are a fair number of differences between the two styles. Let's see. Scott asks, availability of Czech pale lagers is limited in the US, but beyond Pilsner, Urquell, and Czech Far, what would you recommend? In terms of Czech examples, Staropramen is another one that I like. And I will say like Czech Far, I like Czech Far well enough. We had, because I wanted to try while we were over there, we were like, let's grab some cans of Czech Far and see what it's like when it's like fresh or when it's in the Czech Republic. And like, it did not have nearly the amount of character that Pilsner Urquell has. I don't know. Pilsner Urquell is pretty ubiquitous over there. We saw it at so many bars, and once again, we drank a lot of it. But it stands out as being a super characterful example of the style. There's some other good examples of like US made versions, like one of the more widely available. I think Mama's Little Yellow Pills from Oscar Blues does a pretty good job of approximating the style. It's maybe it has even a little bit more hop flavor and aroma than you would expect, but does a good job of approximating it. Otherwise, like I think of breweries that sort of have a focus on German and Czech lager styles. Like we have here in Chicago, Dovetail Brewing, which has a pretty heavy focus on European styles, but especially the majority of what they do is German lagers with some Czech lagers in there. And they do a Czech Pilsner style or Bohemian Pilsner style or Czech Premium Pale Lager style. That is pretty true to this style. So if you are able to encounter like a smaller brewery that sort of has that as their focus, that can be a good way to find good examples of these styles. Somebody asked for favorite American-made versions. I'm going to just go with what I just said. Though honestly, and I saw somebody throw something in there about like drinking Pilsner Urquell from a can. I have a lot of love for this beer. I really think it's just a fantastic beer. And one of the things that is maybe lost on, not that I'm like a wizened old beer drinker, but lost on people who have maybe only been really focused on learning about beer for the last 5 years or so, is that Pilsner Urquell used to be that skunky beer that you drank that was like a step up from an American lager, but like it was just kind of like that nice, like skunky Euro beer. For the longest time, this beer was just available in green glass, and it hasn't even been a decade. It's maybe within the last 6 to 8 years, they did some research and they made some decisions at the brewery that we're going to switch from green bottles to brown glass and cans for packaging to prevent it from getting skunky. And around the same time, they switched to doing entirely cold shipping for shipping beer across the Atlantic, which led to a significant increase in the quality of the beer. This is one of those breweries that I really like to point out, where they made some very distinct changes, not in the way that they make the beer, but in the way that they package the beer and in the way that they ship the beer. Basically, the way that the beer is treated in the finishing stages to make sure that the drinking experience was as good as possible. And so you are able to get this beer in pretty good condition. I saw somebody say ABGB rules. Yes. Austin Beer Garden and Brewery. I can never remember what the acronym stands for. ABGB in Austin is, and they're one of the best lager producers in the country. They have taken so many gold medals in lager styles. It's insane, and their beer is spot on. Austin in general, between them and Live Oak, which also does a really nice Czech Pils, just have good lager beer locked down. If you're able to, I don't think ABGB package anything.
Maybe during quarantine they did a little bit, but not.
Yeah, they might be packaging some stuff right now, but generally they don't package beer. Typically you have to go there to get it. If you're in Austin ever, ABGB, so good. Such a good place to just crush lager, eat a pizza, crush some lager, live your best life. I've got a question about any American hops that are similar to Saaz. Yes. There are a lot of hop varieties around the world that are Saaz is one of the really common cultivars that's been used to breed a number of different hop varieties. And so there are many hop varieties around the world, not all of which necessarily exhibit characteristics of Saaz, but which have been bred from Saaz. I was like, God, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember which hop varieties are most similar. So I asked Shayna just to pull some for me. She said she found notes Sterling as one, which I believe is an American hop. Lublin is in there, which I think is a Polish hop, if I'm not mistaken. So that's kind of off the wall. Tettnang as a German example. There is American Saaz as a possibility, which I would assume is cultivar of the Saaz hop, but grown in the U.S. So yeah. Let's see. And one more question, and I have to, let's see. Scott asks, I'm in the US and have many European favorite beers available in bottles or cans, and I always wonder if there's a difference in flavor when on tap. Not necessarily. I think sometimes people have a perception that draft beer is going to be fresher than bottled or canned beer. In my experience, that's not necessarily the case. In some cases, that's true. But, one thing I've learned over the years is like import and export of beer is hard. It's hard, especially for styles where like it's like a beer that, this beer still tastes, honestly, like it still tastes good 6 months out from when it was packaged, but it tastes best like a week out from when it was packaged. And it's hard to get stuff across an ocean and through distribution and into an account and served in less than like 3 or 4 months. And that's like best case scenario. So I remember I was in China last fall for some exams and was visiting the Stone Brewery there. And, or like the Stone outpost that was there. And they're having beer shipped to them directly from the brewery. They're like owned by the same entity. And they were saying like, we cannot get beer here that's less than, I think they said is somewhere between like 2.5 and 3 months. So, if that's the case where like the supply chain is all within one company, imagine what it is when it has to go from a brewery to an importer to a wholesaler to a bar. So even with kegs are not necessarily going to be super young beer. One of your best options for this beer, and something that you will occasionally see, I know there are certain bars, we have a couple here in Chicago that I can think of that occasionally will bring in like unfiltered, unpasteurized Pilsner Urquell, where they're getting a shipment that's coming in. That beer is going to be pretty young when it gets here. So like that's a case where for this beer, you can try it super fresh. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, to try these beers like as they really are, your best option, unfortunately, is to drink them where they're from. And in some cases, you're better served to find a brewery that does a really good job of producing traditional styles from another region in your location. Like I think about a brewery like Dovetail, where I can get really fresh German and Czech beers made very much to style, but that are only a couple weeks old. So in a lot of cases, that's what I would say. Let's see. Last one that I will take is this one from Buenos Tours about how did lager yeast come about? People were brewing ales for a long time, and then lager yeast seems to have suddenly become a thing in the 1800s. It's actually usually, it's not necessarily the other way around, but lager brewing has been a thing particularly in Germany for a very long time. Yeast as a thing was only really isolated and understood as a brewing ingredient in the late 1800s. But as far as we can tell, in Germany, brewers have been making lagers going as far back as 1600s, early 1600s. And one of the things that really established this, people pay a lot of attention in Germany to the Reinheitsgebot, this purity law that made sure that beer was only made from hops, water, and malt, and then yeast was added later. But a bit later than that, I think 1555, law was put into place that made it so that beer could only be produced between the months, I think, of October and March, basically limiting brewing to the cold months of the year because beer would spoil much more quickly when it was brewed at later periods in the year. So you had brewers brewing both at colder times of the year, but then also, especially later in the season, these are Germans. They didn't want to just drink beer for half the year. So they would be cellaring lots and lots of beer either in caves or in dugout cellars that would remain cold throughout the warmer months of the year. And that sort of developed or selected for use of lager yeast, these yeasts that perform better in cooler temperatures. So at least as far as we know, lager brewing has very much been a thing for 400 or 500 years. And I think that that's all I have to say. So thanks everybody for sticking with for another tasting together session. Thanks for drinking some Czech Premium Pale Lager with me. I see Quaff Life as a hashtag, which I am 100% in support of. Enjoy it, guys. Hopefully we'll see y'all back next week. Next week is wit beer, if I'm not mistaken, which is another highly quaffable style. So hope to see you guys then. Have a good week until then.